For those of you who have been longtime viewers here on the Spector Creative channel, one of the playlists or series that I've been running is a look back at every modern Star Wars figure from Hasbro starting with 1995. And, well, a part of this is because I grew up collecting Star Wars figures and also re-grew up collecting the modern line when it came out while I was in high school, college, and beyond. And the memories I have as a child have really combined with the memories I have as a teenager to create an amazing Star Wars toy collecting experience. Now, while the playlist of going through every wave, figure by figure, in the exact release order of Power of the Force 2 has been going for quite a while now, well, we've actually hit a turning point in the line, which is why we're now at this video. I'm going to include this in the playlist, but it's a video I thought might have a larger appeal to Star Wars collectors in general. Because, well, while we've reached the end of Power of the Force 2, there's a whole new world coming, and it's a very interesting story how this transition happened from Power of the Force 2 to, well, what followed. Now, people have mixed memories of Power of the Force 2. Not all the figures have aged well, but there was a lot of experimentation, both in terms of price increases, pack-ins, and, well, sculpts. Yeah, like I said, not every figure released in Power of the Force 2 holds up, but you can't really pick on too many of them. I mean, this Leia was literally the first Leia ever released in Wave 1, and, Hasbro/Kenner addressed that, and they came out with redos of figures in about the third year of Power of the Force 2, which would have been about 97, 98, when that's basically enough time through the toy-making cycle when feedback can then be incorporated. But Power of the Force 2 also had its huge high points. I mean, it delivered characters that we've never had action figures of before, most notably Grand Moff Tarkin, who was even promoted on packages, never having appeared before in a Kenner collection. And for me, the Jedi spirits that included a Sebastian Shaw Anakin Skywalker pre-special edition, to me this is one of the gems of my collection, and I have Power of the Force 2 to thank. But what really ended Power of the Force 2 was the new beginning that was seen with Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, released in May of 1999. To celebrate this and the fact that we were getting, for the first time, new Star Wars films since '83, a line was put out at the end of Power of the Force 2 called the Flashback Photo Series. So this was a collection of the A-list characters. Characters, like I mentioned earlier, were getting redone throughout the line, although, again, it took 3 years to get to that point. But we also got in the Flashback series some characters we'd never had before, like Aunt Beru, who was definitely on a lot of collectors' lists, and she's one of those figures that really does hold up. In order to promote the figures and their connection to the new upcoming movie, the Flashback figures featured a bio on the back showing the character in the original trilogy, in the new movie, and promoting that coming in the summer of 1999, a new movie with new characters, vehicles, and worlds was coming! So it made sense to get all of the main characters out there again, because a lot of them were going to appear in Episode 1, but in younger form. And, as I mentioned with that Leia figure, other characters like Obi-Wan here, released in Wave 1 of Power of the Force 2 when it came out in '95, definitely looked dated, and toy-making technology had improved. So getting a new version of a character you already had didn't feel like too hard of a pill to swallow, since it was a big improvement. And of course, to tie into the promotions that Episode 1 was coming, not only did you get the bio on the back, but you actually got a flashback photo card. And they really did stand out as some of the best Power of the Force 2 figures made. The improvements in sculpt and articulation, and just, well, general posability and finding fresh takes on these characters was huge. But none of that mattered in the shadow that was Episode 1, because at that time, when it was still a to-be movie, hadn't come out yet, well, our hopes were huge, and we all just expected that this movie was going to be just as big as Empire, Jedi, and A New Hope. So Toys R Us had their very first ever Midnight Madness event, and we all rushed there to buy as much Star Wars product as humanly possible. So while it seemed like a good idea at the time, and there were people who, went a little crazy, that could have very well been me, but it wasn't. I didn't actually put the figures in my mouth. Come on, we all know figures go under your armpits, guys. Well, yeah, it was a buying frenzy. There's videos online showing people buying Darth Mauls that's intercut with refugees from Rwanda getting food. It's pretty much the same type of crowd. And as Episode 1 drew near and we started seeing more footage, trailers, behind the scenes, We all were so excited. We thought Jar Jar was going to be like the coolest thing ever. Okay, I don't. Did we think that? I don't know. It's hard to remember. But I don't think we thought it was going to be the like. Ugh, yeah. The toys did really well though. They made over $1 million in the first 24 hours, which had never happened before. I heard this still talked about in the toy industry when I was at Mattel in the early 2000s. But while sales went up very quickly, they just as quickly went down. Not just because the movie sort of failed to meet the expectations. I mean, it made a lot of money, and it introduced a lot of new characters and new worlds that could continue to be expanded, even with other things that would take place between episode 1 and 2. But that first buying frenzy, which sent profits and sales skyrocketing, was enough sort of proof in the pudding that episode 1 could be its own brand and could essentially continue alongside other toys. The problem was people weren't playing with these toys. They were what's called souveniring them. I'll do a link to the video at the end. I did a whole video about souveniring, but essentially it was people buying toys to say, I saw this movie, I waited in line, I participated in this cultural event, as opposed to the original Kenner line, which was just played with by kids. A huge number of episode 1 figures were being bought by adults and college students, more so than most what would be thought of as adult collector lines. Now, the strength of the original trilogy was felt that it could also carry its own line, with the idea that Power of the Force would continue, but now incorporate the upgrades from episode 1 figures, including the Comm Tech chip. So this was a pack-in, started with episode 1 and then continued with 2 waves, well, 3 waves really, of original trilogy figures, where they would come with this Comm Tech, which would have voice chips, and, well, it didn't go to plan. Power of the Jedi had to be created in order to keep all of these toys on shelf. Why did this happen? Why wasn't the original plan of having Power of the Force 2 and Episode 1 toys side by side to take up even more space in aisle? Well, why couldn't this continue? Essentially, Episode 1 toys, they sold, but not that great. And the Comm Techs were okay. The new concept of Comm Tech 2.0 that was going to have twice the amount of speech, well, you were basically giving fans twice as much of something they didn't really want in the first place. It increased the cost of the figures by $1, and you also had to buy the reader as a separate $20 purchase. Not to mention, the audio just really wasn't that great. So a whole bunch of toys that were designed to be part of the Episode 1 extension, which would have introduced Comm Tech 2.0, a more rounded chip as opposed to the square version, were going to ship and just continue to use the Episode 1 branding, where it could live on the shelf side by side with the green branding that would continue for Power of the Force, which would be classic trilogy characters. So you can see these mock-ups that were done for the characters that were intended to be the continuation of Power of the Force 2, now with the twice the speech Comm Tech. One of the figures that is looked at the most in this sort of transition is the hollow chest Dejeric Chewbacca. So this figure was shown on the cross-sell of the last Power of the Force green carded line, and carded samples have shown up. But with Episode 1 sales tanking as people were really just souveniring and not actually engaging in toy play with the product, it meant that having a standalone Episode 1 line with the 2.0 twice the speech rounded off context really wasn't going to fly. Retailers weren't interested in having 2 different Star Wars lines. So what do you do when you have 2 Star Wars lines and one of them is struggling a little bit? Well, you squish them together and you create one Star Wars line, and this was the very first time a line was created that was going to combine classic trilogy figures, Episode 1 figures, and even Episode 1 concept figures in order to find new ways to keep the main cast on the shelf, finding new ways to sculpt them. So all of these characters that were developed for the Episode 1 line extension for Comm Tech 2.0 were simply just repackaged into Power of the Jedi as a combined line with original trilogy figures. And granted, the Power of the Jedi line, when taken as a whole, did give us some of the strongest Star Wars figures we've ever had. And these figures tend to hold up even more so than Power of the Force, too, simply because articulation and sculpting had improved. And we got a lot of characters that we had as kids that we never got in Power of the Force 2, like Tessek, aka Squidhead. His actually first and only figure in the modern line came out during Power of the Jedi. But we also got brand new characters that we never had as kids and weren't even in Power of the Force 2, like Bo Sheck, a character that was so undeserving of a figure that he got one. Yeah, that's a whole other thing. You can go. I'll be getting to Bo Sheck soon in the series. Power of the Jedi also introduced fan choice figures, and shockingly, a classic trilogy Cantina alien won, because that's what fans want. They want more classic trilogy figures. There's something very magical that, yes, even you can redo characters that had had releases in Power of the Force 2, but could now get better sculpts, improved articulation, soft goods, and, well, giant deluxe releases, like the Slave Leia figure that we'll never ever see on shelf again because Disney's decided this character doesn't exist despite being in 30 minutes of a film. Well, maybe 15 minutes. Power of the Force Jedi was a branding that would also be applied to other scales, like the 12-inch line, which, although it was slowly phasing out, there was a 100th figure done of Luke with every outfit he's ever worn. And going back to the hologram chess-playing Chewbacca, yes, I know it's not chess. Well, this figure, while again originally designed to be part of the Power of the Force 2 Comm Tech line continuation, really just became the first Power of the Jedi figure. The Comm Techs were dropped, and instead we got a brand new pack-in that was going to be less electronic. And the promise of getting twice the speech, again, for a pack-in that we really never wanted in the first place, it just wasn't going to fly. So instead of electronics, we got a piece of paper. And that definitely, I'm sure, helped margins because paper is the least expensive item to put in a toy, especially as a pack-in. I'll link to that video as well at the end. Now, the lineup for Power of the Jedi is interesting because the original trilogy figures for the first few waves were taken from what was going to be the extension of Power of the Force, where main characters were getting sculpt updates. So again, Obi-Wan is back, Leia's back, but in slightly different forms, either new outfits like General Leia, or Obi-Wan without his robes. But because Episode 1 didn't do well, the orders came from Lucasfilm to Hasbro that 50% of Power of the Jedi had to be classic trilogy. So a whole bunch of figures were what's called kit bashed or repainted to make them quick to market. You'll notice that after the main character releases that were already developed for Power of the Force were all very low development original trilogy figures. Other toys that had releases in Power of the Force 2, like the Imperial Biker Scouts, or Scout Troopers, the guys on Endor, or IG-88, they had issues, but they were in, box sets or two-packs. Well, Power of the Jedi now gave these characters their first single card release, and for a lot of us, we thought this was the definitive version of the character. I mean, lo and behold, we would get Scout Troopers for years and get improvements. On the other side of the coin, the Episode 1 figures that were developed as part of the Comm Tech 2.0 program were quite robust. There were a lot of them because the hopes were Episode 1 would be strong enough to continue. So these figures, without the Episode 1 branding, were simply just swept into Power of the Jedi. This is also why a lot of the early Power of the Jedi figures were all from Episode 1, because there were so many figures in development already. And had Episode 1 performed better, not necessarily the movie did obviously a lot of money, but the toy line, it did great in the beginning. Like I said, $1 million in the first 24 hours, but, well, the souveniring took over and the deep character selection just wasn't there. What can I say? I mean, for those of us who grew up with the original trilogy and then saw Episode 1 to say it met our expectations, But Power of the Jedi, on the other hand, because of the order from Lucasfilm to focus 50% of the line on the classic trilogy, well, it meant a lot of tooling suddenly became available for classic trilogy figures, and Power of the Jedi wound up giving us a ton of characters, and quite a few that we've never had since. It led us straight into Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, with, well, our first attacking clone figure ever. Along with Zam Wesell, a droid, and Jango Fett, preview figures were offered on quasi-Power of the Jedi branding. The name was gone, but the branding remained, and the force file inclusion was also removed to show this was more of a transition line before we moved to the full saga line done for Episode 2 that, very interestingly, was not branded Attack of the Clones. The strength of Star Wars as a brand, especially tied to the original trilogy, was clear. The name Star Wars was stronger than the name of the prequel movies. They just weren't hitting it with the way original trilogy fans felt. And there's a reason for that. The original trilogy does stand up, and for those of us who grew up with it, it is, I mean, I will say it is more magical than the prequels of the Disney films. There will be people who disagree with me, but because of the strength of the fan base for what came before, Power of the Jedi became a much heavier original trilogy line. I hope you've enjoyed this look back at the transition between Power of the Force Episode 1 and Power of the Jedi and how it happened. Let me know your thoughts. What are your feelings about the transition? Do you love the prequels more? Did you grow up with them? Let me know in the comment section below. Thanks for sharing, watching, and I'll see you in the next video.